Death is the true inspiring genius, or the muse of philosophy, wherefore Socrates has defined the latter as thanatou meleti. Indeed, without death men would scarcely philosophize. Therefore it will be quite in order that a special consideration of this should have its place here at the beginning of the last, most serious, and most important of our books. The brute lives without a proper knowledge of death. Therefore the individual brute enjoys directly the absolute imperishableness of the species, for it is only conscious of itself as endless. In the case of men, the terrifying certainty of death necessarily entered with reason. But as everywhere in nature, with every evil a means of cure, or at least some compensation is given. The same reflection which introduces the knowledge of death also assists us to metaphysical points of view, which comfort us concerning it, and of which the brute has no need and is incapable. All religious and philosophical systems are principally directed to this end, and are thus primarily the antidote to the certainty of death, which the reflective reason produces out of its own means. Yet the degree in which they attain this end is very different, and certainly one religion or philosophy will, far more than the others, enable men to look death in the face with a quiet glance. Brahmanism and Buddhism, which teach man to regard himself as himself, the original being, the Brahm, to which all coming into being and passing away is essentially foreign, will achieve much more in this respect than such as teach that man is made out of nothing, and actually begins at birth, his existence derived from another. Answering to this, we find in India a confidence and a contempt for death, of which one has no conception in Europe. It is, in fact, a hazardous thing to force upon a man, by early imprinting them, weak and untenable conceptions in this important regard, and thereby making him forever incapable of taking up correct and stable ones. For example, to teach him that he recently came out of nothing, and consequently through an eternity has been nothing, but yet for the future will be imperishable, is just the same as to teach him that although he is through and through the work of another, yet he will be held responsible through all eternity for his actions. If, then, when the mind ripens and reflection appears, the untenable nature of such doctrines forces itself upon him, he has nothing better to put in its place, nay, is no longer capable of understanding anything better, and thus loses the comfort which nature had destined for him also, as a compensation for the certainty of death. In consequence of such a process, we see even now in England, 1844, among ruined factory hands, the socialists, and in Germany among ruined students, the young Hegelians, sink to the absolutely physical point of view, which leads to the result, edite, bibite, post mortem nulla voluptas, and so far may be defined as bestialism. However, after all that has been taught concerning death, it cannot be denied that, at least in Europe, the opinion of men, nay, often even of the same individual, very frequently vacillates between the conception of death as absolute annihilation and the assumption that we are, as it were, with skin and hair, immortal. Both are equally false. But we have not so much to find a correct mean, as rather to gain the higher point of view from which such notions disappear of themselves. In these considerations I shall first of all start from the purely empirical standpoint. Here there primarily lies before us the undeniable fact that according to the natural consciousness, man not only fears death for his own person more than anything else, but also weeps violently over the death of those that belong to him, and indeed clearly not egotistically for his own loss, but out of sympathy for the great misfortune that has befallen them. Therefore he also censures those who in such a case neither weep nor show sadness as hard-hearted and unloving. It is parallel with this that revenge, in its highest degree, seeks the death of the adversary as the greatest evil that can be inflicted. Opinions change with time and place, but the voice of nature remains always and everywhere the same, and is therefore to be heeded before everything else. Now here it seems distinctly to say that death is a great evil. In the language of nature, death means annihilation, and that death is a serious matter may be concluded from the fact that, as everyone knows, life is no joke. We must indeed deserve nothing better than these two. In fact, the fear of death is independent of all knowledge, for the brute has it, although it does not know death. Everything that is born brings it with it into the world. But this fear of death is a priori, only the reverse side of the will to live, which indeed we all are. Therefore in every brute the fear of its destruction is inborn, like the care for its maintenance. Thus it is the fear of death, and not the mere avoidance of pain, which shows itself in the anxious carefulness with which the brute seeks to protect itself, and still more its brood, from everything that might become dangerous. Why does the brute flee, trembling, and seek to conceal itself? Because it is simply the will to live, but as such is forfeited to death and wishes to gain time. Such also by nature is man. The greatest evil, the worst that can anywhere threaten, is death. The greatest fear is the fear of death. Nothing excites us so irresistibly to the most lively interest as danger to the life of others. Nothing is so shocking as an execution. Now the boundless attachment to life, which appears here, cannot have sprung from knowledge and reflection. To these it rather appears foolish, for the objective worth of life is very uncertain, and at least it remains doubtful whether it is preferable to not being, nay, if experience and reflection come to be expressed, not being must certainly win. If one knocked on the graves and asked the dead whether they wished to rise again, they would shake their heads. Such is the opinion of Socrates in Plato's Apology, and even the gay and amiable Voltaire cannot help saying, "On aime la vie, mais le néant ne laisse pas d'avoir du bon." And again, "Je ne sais pas ce que c'est que la vie éternelle, mais ceci est une mauvaise plaisanterie." Besides, life must in any case soon end, so that the few years which perhaps one has yet to be vanish entirely before the endless time when one will be no more. Accordingly, it appears to reflection even ludicrous to be so anxious about this span of time, to tremble so much if our own life or that of another is in danger, and to compose tragedies, the horror of which has its strength in the fear of death. That powerful attachment to life is therefore irrational and blind. It can only be explained from the fact that our whole inner nature is itself will to live, to which therefore life must appear as the highest good, however embittered, short, and uncertain it may always be, and that will, in itself and originally, is unconscious and blind. Knowledge, on the contrary, far from being the source of that attachment to life, even works against it, for it discloses the worthlessness of life, and thus combats the fear of death. When it conquers, and accordingly the man faces death courageously and composedly, this is honored as great and noble. Thus we hail then the triumph of knowledge over the blind will to live, which is yet the kernel of our own being. In the same way, we despise him in whom knowledge is defeated in that conflict, and who therefore clings unconditionally to life, struggles to the utmost against approaching death, and receives it with despair. And yet in him it is only the most original being of ourselves and of nature that expresses itself. We may here ask in passing, how could this boundless love of life and endeavor to maintain it in every way as long as possible be regarded as base, contemptible, and by the adherents of every religion as unworthy of this, if it were the gift of good gods, to be recognized with thankfulness? And how could it then seem great and noble to esteem it highly? Meanwhile, what is confirmed by these considerations is, 1, that the will to live is the inmost nature of man, 2, that in itself it is unconscious and blind, 3, that knowledge is an adventitious principle, which is originally foreign to the will, 4, that knowledge conflicts with the will, and that our judgment applauds the victory of knowledge over the will. If what makes death seem so terrible to us were the thought of not being, we would necessarily think with equal horror of the time when as yet we were not. For it is irrefutably certain that not being after death cannot be different from not being before birth, and consequently is also no more deplorable. A whole eternity has run its course, while as yet we were not, but that by no means disturbs us. On the other hand, we find it hard, nay, unendurable, that after the momentary intermezzo of an ephemeral existence, a second eternity should follow, in which we shall no longer be. Should then this thirst for existence have arisen because we have now tasted it and have found it so delightful? As was already briefly explained above, certainly not. Far sooner could the experience gained have awakened an infinite longing for the lost paradise of non-existence. To the hope also of the immortality of the soul, there is always added that of a better world, a sign that the present world is not much good. Notwithstanding all this, the question as to our state after death has certainly been discussed, in books and verbally, 10,000 times oftener than the question as to our state before birth. Yet theoretically the one is just as near at hand and as fair a problem as the other. And besides, whoever had answered the one would soon see to the bottom of the other. We have fine declamations about how shocking it would be to think that the mind of man, which embraces the world and has so many very excellent thoughts, should sink with him into the grave. But we hear nothing about this mind having allowed a whole eternity to pass before it came into being with these its qualities, and how the world must have had to do without it all that time. Yet no question presents itself more naturally to knowledge, uncorrupted by the will, than this. An infinite time has passed before my birth. What was I during this time? Metaphysically, it might perhaps be answered, I was always I. That is, all who during that time said I were just I. But let us look away from this to our present entirely empirical point of view and assume that I did not exist at all. Then I can console myself as to the infinite time after my death, when I shall not be, with the infinite time when I already was not, as a well-accustomed and indeed very comfortable state. For the eternity a parte post without me can be just as little fearful as the eternity a parte ante without me, since the two are distinguished by nothing except the interposition of an ephemeral dream of life. All proofs also for continued existence after death may just as well be applied in partem ante, where they then demonstrate existence before life, in the assumption of which the Hindus and Buddhists therefore show themselves very consistent. Kant's ideality of time alone solves all these riddles. But we are not speaking of that now. This, however, results from what has been said, that to mourn for the time when one will be no more is just as absurd as it would be to mourn over the time when as yet one was not. For it is all the same whether the time which our existence does not fill is related to that which it does fill as future or as past. But also, regarded entirely apart from these temporal considerations, it is in and for itself absurd to look upon not being as an evil. For every evil as every good presupposes existence, nay, even consciousness. But the latter ceases with life, as also in sleep and in a swoon. Therefore the absence of it is well known to us and trusted, as containing no evil at all. Its entrance, however, is always an affair of a moment. From this point of view, Epicurus considered death, and therefore quite rightly said, "O thanatos miden pros imas," death does not concern us, with the explanation that when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. To have lost what cannot be missed is clearly no evil. Therefore ceasing to be ought to disturb us as little as not having been. Accordingly, from the standpoint of knowledge, there appears absolutely no reason to fear death. But consciousness consists in knowing, therefore for consciousness, death is no evil. Moreover, it is really not this knowing part of our ego that fears death, but the fuga mortis proceeds entirely and alone from the blind will, of which everything living is filled. To this, however, as was already mentioned above, it is essential, just because it is will to live, whose whole nature consists in the effort after life and existence, and which is not originally endowed with knowledge, but only in consequence of its objectification in animal individuals. If now the will, by means of knowledge, beholds death as the end of the phenomenon with which it has identified itself, and to which therefore it sees itself limited, its whole nature struggles against it with all its might. Whether now it has really something to fear from death, we will investigate further on, and will then remember the real source of the fear of death, which has been shown here along with the requisite distinction of the willing and the knowing part of our nature. Corresponding to this, then, what makes death so terrible to us is not so much the end of life, for this can appear to no one specially worthy of regret, but rather the destruction of the organism, really because this is the will itself exhibiting itself as body. But we only really feel this destruction in the evils of disease or of old age. Death itself, on the other hand, consists for the subject only in the moment when consciousness vanishes, because the activity of the brain ceases. The extension of the stoppage to all the other parts of the organism, which follows this, is really already an event after death. Thus death, in a subjective regard, concerns the consciousness alone. Now what the vanishing of this may be, everyone can to a certain extent judge of from going to sleep. But it is still better known to whoever has really fainted, for in this the transition is not so gradual, nor accompanied by dreams. But first the power of sight leaves us, still fully conscious, and then immediately the most profound unconsciousness enters. The sensation that accompanies it, so far as it goes, is anything but disagreeable. And without doubt, as sleep is the brother of death, so the swoon is its twin brother. Even violent death cannot be painful, for even severe wounds are not felt at all till some time afterwards, often not till the outward signs of them are observed. If they are rapidly mortal, consciousness will vanish before this discovery. If they result in death later, then it is the same as with other illnesses. All those also who have lost consciousness in water, or from charcoal fumes, or through hanging, are well known to say that it happened without pain. And now finally, the death which is properly in accordance with nature, death from old age, euthanasia, is a gradual vanishing and sinking out of existence in an imperceptible manner. Little by little in old age, the passions and desires with the susceptibility for their objects are extinguished. The emotions no longer find anything to excite them, for the power of presenting ideas to the mind always becomes weaker, its images fainter. The impressions no longer cleave to us, but pass over without leaving a trace. The days roll ever faster, events lose their significance, everything grows pale. The old man stricken in years totters about or rests in a corner, now only a shadow, a ghost of his former self. What remains there for death to destroy? One day asleep is his last, and his dreams are... They are the dreams which Hamlet inquires after in the famous soliloquy. I believe we dream them even now. I have here also to remark that the maintenance of the life process, although it has a metaphysical basis, does not go on without resistance, and consequently not without effort. It is this to which the organism yields every night, on account of which it then suspends the brain function and diminishes certain secretions, the respiration, the pulse, and the development of heat. From this we may conclude that the entire ceasing of the life process must be a wonderful relief to its motive force. Perhaps this has some share in the expression of sweet contentment on the face of most dead persons. In general, the moment of death may be like the moment of awaking from a heavy dream that has oppressed us like a nightmare. Up to this point, the result we have arrived at is that death, however much it may be feared, can yet really be no evil. But often it even appears as a good thing, as something wished for, as a friend. All that have met with insuperable obstacles to their existence or their efforts, that suffer from incurable diseases or inconsolable griefs, have as a last refuge, which generally opens to them of its own accord, the return into the womb of nature, from which they arose for a short time, enticed by the hope of more favorable conditions of existence, then have fallen to their lot, and the same path out of which constantly remains open. That return is the cassio bonorum of life. Yet even here it is only entered upon after a physical and moral conflict. So hard does one struggle against returning to the place from which one came out so lightly and readily, to an existence which has so much suffering and so little pleasure to offer. The Hindus give the god of death, Yama, two faces, one very fearful and terrible, and one very cheerful and benevolent. This partly explains itself from the reflections we have just made. At the empirical point of view at which we still stand, the following consideration is one which presents itself of its own accord, and therefore deserves to be accurately defined by illustration, and thereby referred to its proper limits. The sight of a dead body shows me that sensibility, irritability, circulation of the blood, reproduction, etc., have here ceased. I conclude from this with certainty that what actuated these hitherto, which was yet always something unknown to me, now actuates them no longer, thus has departed from them. But if I should now wish to add that this must have been just what I have known only as consciousness, consequently as intelligence, soul, this would be not only an unjustified, but clearly a false conclusion. For consciousness has always showed itself to me not as the cause, but as the product and result of the organized life. For it rose and sank in consequence of this in the different periods of life, in health and sickness, in sleep, in a swoon, in a waking, etc. Thus always appeared as effect, never as cause of the organized life. Always showed itself as something which arises and passes away, and again arises, so long as the conditions of this still exist, but not apart from them. Nay, I may also have seen that the complete derangement of consciousness, madness, far from dragging down with it and depressing the other forces, or indeed endangering life, heightens these very much, especially irritability or muscular force, and rather lengthens than shortens life if other causes do not come in. Then also I knew individuality as a quality of everything organized, and therefore, if this is a self-conscious organism, also of consciousness. But there exists no occasion now to conclude that individuality was inherent in that vanished principle which imparts life, and is completely unknown to me. All the less so as I see that everywhere in nature each particular phenomenon is the work of a general force, which is active in thousands of similar phenomena. But on the other hand, there is just as little occasion to conclude that because the organized life has ceased here, that force which hitherto actuated it has also become nothing, as little as to infer the death of the spinner from the stopping of the spinning wheel. If a pendulum, by finding its center of gravity, at last comes to rest, and thus its individual apparent life has ceased, no one will imagine that gravitation is now annihilated, but every one comprehends that after as before it is active in innumerable phenomena. Certainly it might be urged against this comparison that here also in this pendulum gravitation has not ceased to be active, but only to manifest its activity palpably. Whoever insists on this may think instead of an electrical body, in which after its discharge electricity has actually ceased to be active. I only wish to show in this that we ourselves recognize in the lowest forces of nature an eternity and ubiquity with regard to which the transitory nature of their fleeting phenomena never makes us err for a moment. So much the less, then, should it come into our mind to regard the ceasing of life as the annihilation of the living principle, and consequently death as the entire destruction of the man. Because the strong arm which 3,000 years ago bent the bow of Ulysses is no more, no reflective and well-regulated understanding will regard the force which acted so energetically in it as entirely annihilated, and therefore upon further reflection will also not assume that the force which bends the bow today first began with this arm. The thought lies far nearer us, that the force which earlier actuated the life which now has vanished is the same which is active in the life which now flourishes. Nay, this is almost inevitable. Certainly, however, we know that, as was explained in the second book, only that is perishable which is involved in the causal series, but only the states and forms are so involved. On the other hand, untouched by the change of these which is introduced by causes, there remain on the one side matter, and on the other side natural forces, for both are the presupposition of all these changes. But the principle of our life we must primarily, at least, conceive as a force of nature, until perhaps a more profound investigation has brought us to know what it is in itself. Thus, taken simply as a force of nature, the vital force remains entirely undisturbed by the change of forms and states, which the bond of cause and effect introduces and carries off again, and which alone are subject to the process of coming into being and passing away, as it lies before us in experience. Thus, so far, the imperishable nature of our true being can be proved with certainty. But it is true this will not satisfy the claims which are wont to be made upon proofs of our continued existence after death, nor ensure the consolation which is expected from such proofs. However, it is always something, and whoever fears death as an absolute annihilation cannot afford to despise the perfect certainty that the inmost principle of his life remains untouched by it. Nay, the paradox might be set up that that second thing also, which, just like the forces of nature, remains untouched by the continual change under the guidance of causality, thus matter by its absolute permanence ensures us indestructibility, by virtue of which whoever was incapable of comprehending any other might yet confidently trust in a certain imperishableness. What, it will be said, the permanence of the mere dust of the crude matter is to be regarded as a continuance of our being? Oh, do you know this dust then? Do you know what it is and what it can do? Learn to know it before you despise it. This matter which now lies there as dust and ashes will soon, dissolved in water, form itself as a crystal, will shine as metal, will then emit electric sparks, will by means of its galvanic intensity manifest a force which, decomposing the closest combinations, reduces earths to metals. Nay, it will of its own accord form itself into plants and animals, and from its mysterious womb develop that life for the loss of which you in your narrowness are so painfully anxious. Is it then absolutely nothing to continue to exist as such matter? Nay, I seriously assert that even this permanence of matter affords evidence of the indestructibility of our true nature, though only as in an image or simile, or rather only as an outline. To see this we only need to call to mind the explanation of matter given in chapter 24, from which it resulted that mere formless matter, this basis of the world of experience which is never perceived for itself alone, but assumed as constantly remaining, is the immediate reflection, the visibility in general of the thing in itself, thus of the will. Therefore, whatever absolutely pertains to the will as such holds good also of matter, and it reflects the true eternal nature of the will under the image of temporal imperishableness. Because, as has been said, nature does not lie, no view which has sprung from a purely objective comprehension of it and been logically thought out can be absolutely false, but at the most only very one-sided and imperfect. Such, however, is indisputably consistent materialism, for instance that of Epicurus, just as well as the absolute idealism opposed to it, like that of Berkeley. And in general, every philosophical point of view which has proceeded from a correct aperçu and been honestly carried out. Only they are all exceedingly one-sided comprehensions, and therefore, in spite of their opposition, they are all true, each from a different point of view. But as soon as one has risen above this point of view, then they only appear as relatively and conditionally true. The highest standpoint alone, from which one surveys them all and knows them in their relative truth, but also beyond this in their falseness, can be that of absolute truth so far as this is in general attainable. Accordingly, we see, as was shown above, that in the very crude and therefore very old point of view of materialism proper, the indestructibility of our true nature in itself is represented, as by a mere shadow of it, the imperishableness of matter, as in the already higher naturalism of an absolute physics, it is represented by the ubiquity and eternity of the natural forces, among which the vital force is at least to be counted. Thus even these crude points of view contain the assertion that the living being suffers no absolute annihilation through death, but continues to exist in and with the whole of nature. The considerations which have brought us to this point, and to which the further explanations link themselves on, started from the remarkable fear of death which fills all living beings. But now we will change the standpoint and consider how, in contrast to the individual beings, the whole of nature bears itself with reference to death. In doing this, however, we still always remain upon the ground of experience. Certainly we know no higher game of chance than that for death and life. Every decision about this we watch with the utmost excitement, interest, and fear, for in our eyes all in all is at stake. On the other hand, nature, which never lies, but is always straightforward and open, speaks quite differently upon this theme, speaks like Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. What it says is this: the death or the life of the individual is of no significance. It expresses this by the fact that it exposes the life of every brute, and even of man, to the most insignificant accidents without coming to the rescue. Consider the insect on your path. A slight unconscious turning of your step is decisive as to its life or death. Look at the wood snail, without any means of flight, of defense, of deception, of concealment, a ready prey for all. Look at the fish carelessly playing in the still open net, the frog restrained by its laziness from the flight which might save it, the bird that does not know of the falcon that soars above it, the sheep which the wolf eyes and examines from the thicket. All these, provided with little foresight, go about guilelessly among the dangers that threaten their existence every moment. Since now nature exposes its organisms, constructed with such inimitable skill, not only to the predatory instincts of the stronger, but also to the blindest chance, to the humor of every fool, the mischievousness of every child without reserve, it declares that the annihilation of these individuals is indifferent to it, does it no harm, has no significance, and that in these cases the effect is of no more importance than the cause. It says this very distinctly and does not lie, only it makes no comments on its utterances, but rather expresses them in the laconic style of an oracle. If now the All-Mother sends forth her children without protection to 1,000 threatening dangers, this can only be because she knows that if they fall back into her womb, where they are safe. Therefore their fall is a mere jest. Nature does not act otherwise with man than with the brutes. Therefore its declaration extends also to man. The life and death of the individual are indifferent to it. Accordingly, in a certain sense, they ought also to be indifferent to us, for we ourselves are indeed nature. Certainly, if only we saw deep enough, we would agree with nature, and regard life and death as indifferently as it does. Meanwhile, by means of reflection, we must attribute that carelessness and indifference of nature towards the life of the individuals to the fact that the destruction of such a phenomenon does not in the least affect its true and proper nature. If we further ponder the fact that not only, as we have just seen, are life and death dependent upon the most trifling accidents, but that the existence of the organized being in general is an ephemeral one, that animal and plant arise today and pass away tomorrow, and birth and death follow in quick succession, while to the unorganized things which stand so much lower, an incomparably longer duration is assured, and an infinite duration to the absolutely formless matter alone, to which indeed we attribute this a priori. Then, I think, the thought must follow of its own accord, even from the purely empirical, but objective and unprejudiced comprehension of such an order of things, that this is only a superficial phenomenon, that such a constant arising and passing away can by no means touch the root of things, but can only be relative, nay, only apparent, in which the true inner nature of that thing is not included, the nature of which everywhere evades our glance and is thoroughly mysterious, but rather that this continues to exist undisturbed by it. Although we can neither apprehend nor conceive the manner in which this happens, and must therefore think of it only generally as a kind of tour de passe-passe which took place there. For that, while what is most imperfect, the lowest, the unorganized, continues to exist unassailed, It is just the most perfect beings, the living creatures, with their infinitely complicated and inconceivably ingenious organizations, which constantly arise, new from the very foundation, and after a brief span of time absolutely pass into nothingness, to make room for other new ones like them coming into existence out of nothing. This is something so obviously absurd that it can never be the true order of things, but rather a mere veil which conceals this, or more accurately, a phenomenon conditioned by the nature of our intellect. Nay, the whole being and not being itself of these individuals, in relation to which death and life are opposites, can only be relative. Thus, the language of nature, in which it is given us as absolute, cannot be the true and ultimate expression of the nature of things and of the order of the world, but only as a patois du pays, that is, something merely relatively true, something to be understood cum grano salis, or to speak properly, something conditioned by our intellect. I say an immediate intuitive conviction of the kind which I have tried to describe in words will press itself upon everyone. That is, certainly only upon everyone whose mind is not of an utterly ordinary species, which is absolutely only capable of knowing the particular simply and solely as such, which is strictly limited to the knowledge of individuals after the manner of the intellect of the brutes. Whoever, on the other hand, by means of a capacity of an only somewhat higher power, even just begins to see in the individual beings their universal, their ideas, will also to a certain extent participate in that conviction, and that indeed as an immediate and therefore certain conviction. In fact, it is also only small limited minds that fear death quite seriously as their annihilation, and persons of decidedly superior capacity are completely free from such terrors. Plato rightly bases the whole of philosophy upon the knowledge of the doctrine of ideas, that is, upon the perception of the universal in the particular. But the conviction here described, which proceeds directly from the comprehension of nature, must have been exceedingly vivid in those sublime authors of the Upanishads of the Vedas, who can scarcely be thought of as mere men, for it speaks to us so forcibly out of an innumerable number of their utterances that we must ascribe this immediate illumination of their mind to the fact that these wise men, standing nearer the origin of our race in time, comprehended the nature of things more clearly and profoundly than the already deteriorated race, oio nun bratoi esin, is able to do. But certainly their comprehension is assisted by the natural world of India, which is endowed with life in a very different degree from our northern world. However, thorough reflection, as pursued by Kant's great mind, leads by another path to the same result, for it teaches us that our intellect, in which that phenomenal world which changes so fast exhibits itself, does not comprehend the true ultimate nature of things, but merely its phenomenal manifestations, and indeed, as I add, because it is originally only destined to present the motives to our will, that is, to be serviceable to it in the pursuit of its paltry ends. Let us, however, carry our objective and unprejudiced consideration of nature still further. If I kill a living creature, whether a dog, a bird, a frog, or even only an insect, it is really inconceivable that this being, or rather the original force by virtue of which such a marvelous phenomenon exhibited itself just the moment before, in its full energy and love of life, should have been annihilated by my wicked or thoughtless act. And again, on the other hand, the millions of animals of every kind, which come into existence every moment, in infinite variety, full of force and activity, can never, before the act of their generation, have been nothing at all, and have attained from nothing to an absolute beginning. If now in this way I see one of these withdraw itself from my sight, without me knowing where it goes, and another appear without me knowing whence it comes, if, moreover, both have the same form, the same nature, the same character, and only not the same matter, which yet during their existence they continually throw off and renew, then certainly the assumption that that which vanishes and that which appears in its place are one and the same, which has only experienced a slight alteration, a renewal of the form of its existence, and that consequently death is for the species what sleep is for the individual. This assumption, I say, lies so close at hand that it is impossible not to light upon it, unless the mind, perverted in early youth by the imprinting of false views, hurries it out of the way, even from a distance, with superstitious fear. But the opposite assumption, that the birth of an animal is an arising out of nothing, and accordingly that its death is its absolute annihilation, and this with a further addition that man, who has also originated out of nothing, has yet an individual endless existence, and indeed a conscious existence, while the dog, the ape, the elephant are annihilated by death, is really something against which the healthy mind revolts, and which it must regard as absurd. If, as is sufficiently often repeated, the comparison of the results of a system with the utterances of a healthy mind is supposed to be a touchstone of its truth, I wish the adherents of the system which was handed down from Descartes to the pre-Kantian eclectics, nay, which even now is still the prevailing view of the great majority of cultured people in Europe, would apply this touchstone here. Throughout and everywhere, the true symbol of nature is the circle, because it is the schema or type of recurrence. This is in fact the most universal form in nature, which it carries out in everything, from the course of the stars down to the death and the genesis of organized beings, and by which alone, in the ceaseless stream of time and its content, a permanent existence, that is, a nature, becomes possible. If in autumn we consider the little world of insects, and see how one prepares its bed to sleep the long, rigid winter sleep, another spins its cocoon to pass the winter as a chrysalis, and awake in spring rejuvenated and perfected, and finally how most of them, intending themselves to rest in the arms of death, merely arrange with care the suitable place for their egg, in order to issue forth again from it some day renewed. This is nature's great doctrine of immortality, which seeks to teach us that there is no radical difference between sleep and death, but the one endangers existence just as little as the other. The care with which the insect prepares a cell or hole or nest, deposits its egg in it, together with food for the larva that will come out of it in the following spring, and then quietly dies, is just like the care with which in the evening a man lays ready his clothes and his breakfast for the next morning, and then quietly goes to sleep. And at bottom it could not take place at all, if it were not that the insect which dies in autumn is in itself, and according to its true nature, just as much identical with the one which is hatched out in the spring, as the one who lies down to sleep is identical with the man who rises from it. If now, after these considerations, we return to ourselves and our own species, then cast our glance forward far into the future, and seek to present to our minds the future generations with the millions of their individuals in the strange form of their customs and pursuits, and then interpose with the question, whence will all these come? Where are they now? Where is the fertile womb of that nothing, pregnant with worlds, which still conceals the coming races? Would not the smiling and true answer to this be, where else should they be, than there where alone the real always was and will be, in the present and its content? Thus with thee, the foolish questioner, who in this mistaking of his own nature is like the leaf upon the tree, which fading in autumn and about to fall complains at its destruction, and will not be consoled by looking forward to the fresh green which will clothe the tree in spring, but says lamenting, I am not these are quite different leaves. O foolish leaf, whither wilt thou, and whence should others come? Where is the nothing whose abyss thou fearest? Know thine own nature, that which is so filled with thirst for existence. Recognize it in the inner, mysterious, germinating force of the tree, which, constantly one and the same in all generations of leaves, remains untouched by all arising and passing away. And now, per fulon genen toide kai andron, that is, qualis foliorum generatio, talis et hominum. Whether the fly which now buzzes round me goes to sleep in the evening, and buzzes again tomorrow, or dies in the evening, and in spring another fly buzzes which has sprung from its egg, that is in itself the same thing. But therefore the knowledge which exhibits this as two fundamentally different things is not unconditioned, but relative, a knowledge of the phenomenon, not of the thing in itself. In the morning the fly exists again. It also exists again in the spring. What distinguishes for it the winter from the night? In Burdach's Physiology, Volume 1, Section 275, we read, till 10 o'clock in the morning no Cercaria ephemera, one of the infusoria, is to be seen in the infusion, and at 12 the whole water swarms with them. In the evening they die, and the next morning they again appear anew. So it was observed by Nietzsche 6 days running. So everything lingers but a moment and hastens on to death. The plant and the insect die at the end of the summer, the brute and the man after a few years. Death reaps unweariedly. Yet notwithstanding this, nay, as if this were not so at all, everything is always there and in its place, just as if everything were imperishable. The plant always thrives and blooms, the insect hums, the brute and the man exist in unwasted youth, and the cherries that have already been enjoyed 1,000 times we have again before us every summer. The nations also exist as immortal individuals, although sometimes their names change. Even their action, what they do and suffer, is always the same, although history always pretends to relate something different. For it is like the kaleidoscope, which at every turn shows a new figure, while we really always have the same thing before our eyes. What then presses itself more irresistibly upon us than the thought that that arising and passing away does not concern the real nature of things, but this remains untouched by it, thus is imperishable, and therefore all and each that wills to exist actually exists continuously and without end. Accordingly, at every given point of time, all species of animals, from the gnat to the elephant, exist together complete. They have already renewed themselves many thousand times, and withal have remained the same. They know nothing of others like them, who have lived before them or will live after them. It is the species which always lives, and in the consciousness of the imperishable nature of the species and their identity with it, the individuals cheerfully exist. The will to live manifests itself in an endless present, because this is the form of the life of the species, which, therefore, never grows old, but remains always young. Death is for it what sleep is for the individual, or what winking is for the eye, by the absence of which the Indian gods are known, if they appear in human form. As through the entrance of night the world vanishes, but yet does not for a moment cease to exist, so man and brute apparently pass away through death, and yet their true nature continues just as undisturbed by it. Let us now think of that alternation of death and birth as infinitely rapid vibrations, and we have before us the enduring objectification of the will, the permanent ideas of being, fixed like the rainbow on the waterfall. This is temporal immortality. In consequence of this, notwithstanding thousands of years of death and decay, nothing has been lost, not an atom of the matter, still less anything of the inner being that exhibits itself as nature. Therefore, every moment we can cheerfully cry, in spite of time, death, and decay, we are still all together. Perhaps we would have to accept whoever had once said from the bottom of his heart with regard to this game, "I want no more," but this is not yet the place to speak of this. But we have certainly to draw attention to the fact that the pain of birth and the bitterness of death are the two constant conditions under which the will to live maintains itself in its objectification. That is, our inner nature, untouched by the course of time and the death of races, exists in an everlasting present, and enjoys the fruit of the assertion of the will to live. This is analogous to the fact that we can only be awake during the day on condition that we sleep during the night. And indeed the latter is the commentary which nature offers us for the understanding of that difficult passage. For the substratum, or the content, pleroma, or the material of the present, is through all time really the same. The impossibility of knowing this identity directly is just time, a form and limitation of our intellect. That on account of it, for example, the future event is not yet, depends upon an illusion of which we become conscious when that event has come. That the essential form of our intellect introduces such an illusion explains and justifies itself from the fact that the intellect has come forth from the hands of nature by no means for the apprehension of the nature of things, but merely for the apprehension of motives, thus for the service of an individual and temporal phenomenon of will. Whoever comprehends the reflections which here occupy us will also understand the true meaning of the paradoxical doctrine of the Eleatics, that there is no arising and passing away, but the whole remains immovable. Certainly in the sense in which when he is begotten, the man arises out of nothing, he becomes nothing through death. But really to learn to know this nothing would be very interesting, for it only requires moderate acuteness to see that this empirical nothing is by no means absolute, that is, such as would in every sense be nothing. We are already led to this insight by the observation that all qualities of the parents recur in the children, thus have overcome death. Of this, however, I will speak in a special chapter. There is no greater contrast than that between the ceaseless flight of time, which carries its whole content with it, and the rigid immobility of what is actually present, which at all times is one and the same. And if from this point of view we watch in a purely objective manner the immediate events of life, the nunc stans becomes clear and visible to us in the center of the wheel of time. To the eye of a being of incomparably longer life, which at one glance comprehended the human race in its whole duration, the constant alternation of birth and death would present itself as a continuous vibration, and accordingly it would not occur to it at all to see in this an ever new arising out of nothing and passing into nothing. But just as to our sight the quickly revolving spark appears as a continuous circle, the rapidly vibrating spring as a permanent triangle, the vibrating cord as a spindle, so to this eye the species would appear as that which has being and permanence, death and life as vibrations. We will have false conceptions of the indestructibility of our true nature by death, so long as we do not make up our minds to study it primarily in the brutes, but claim for ourselves alone a class apart from them under the boastful name of immortality. But it is this pretension alone, and the narrowness of view from which it proceeds, on account of which most men struggle so obstinately against the recognition of the obvious truth that we are essentially and in the chief respect the same as the brutes, nay, that they recoil at every hint of our relationship with these. But it is this denial of the truth which more than anything else closes against them the path to real knowledge of the indestructibility of our nature. For if we seek anything upon a wrong path, we have just on that account forsaken the right path, and upon the path we follow, we will never attain to anything in the end but late disillusion. Up then, follow the truth, not according to preconceived notions, but as nature leads. First of all, learn to recognize in the aspect of every young animal the existence of the species that never grows old, which, as a reflection of its eternal youth, imparts to every individual a temporary youth, and lets it come forth as new and fresh as if the world were of today. Let one ask himself honestly whether the swallow of this year's spring is absolutely a different one from the swallow of the first spring, and whether really between the two the miracle of the creation out of nothing has repeated itself millions of times in order to work just as often into the hands of absolute annihilation. I know well that if I seriously assured anyone that the cat which now plays in the yard is still the same one which made the same springs and played the same tricks there 300 years ago, he would think I was mad. But I also know that it is much madder to believe that the cat of today is through and in its whole nature quite a different one from the cat of 300 years ago. One only requires truly and seriously to sink oneself in the contemplation of one of these higher vertebrates in order to become distinctly conscious that this unfathomable nature, taken as a whole, as it exists there, cannot possibly become nothing. And yet, on the other hand, one knows its transitoriness. This depends upon the fact that in this animal the infinite nature of its idea, species, is imprinted in the finiteness of the individual. For in a certain sense, it is of course true that in the individual we always have before us another being, in the sense which depends upon the principle of sufficient reason, in which are also included time and space, which constitute the principium individuationis. But in another sense it is not true, in the sense in which reality belongs to the permanent forms of things, the ideas alone, and which was so clearly evident to Plato that it became his fundamental thought, the centre of his philosophy, and he made the comprehension of it the criterion of capacity for philosophizing in general. As the scattered drops of the roaring waterfall change with lightning rapidity, while the rainbow, whose supporter they are, remains immovably at rest, quite untouched by that ceaseless change, so every idea, that is, every species of living creature, remains quite untouched by the continual change of its individuals. But it is the idea, or the species in which the will to live is really rooted, and manifests itself, and therefore also the will is only truly concerned in the continuance of the species. For example, the lions which are born and die are like the drops of the waterfall, but the leonitas, the idea or form of the lion, is like the unshaken rainbow upon it. Therefore Plato attributed true being to the ideas alone, that is, to the species; to the individuals only a ceaseless arising and passing away. From the profound consciousness of his imperishable nature really springs also the confidence and peace of mind with which every brute and even human individual moves unconcernedly along amid a host of chances, which may annihilate it any moment, and moreover move straight on to death. Out of its eyes, however, there shines the peace of the species, which that death does not affect and does not concern. Even to man this peace could not be imparted by uncertain and changing dogmas. But, as was said, the contemplation of every animal teaches that death is no obstacle to the kernel of life, to the will in its manifestation. What an unfathomable mystery lies, then, in every animal! Look at the nearest one. Look at your dog, how cheerfully and peacefully he lives. Many thousands of dogs have had to die before it came to this one's turn to live. But the death of these thousands has not affected the idea of the dog. It has not been in the least disturbed by all that dying. Therefore the dog exists as fresh and endowed with primitive force as if this were its first day, and none could ever be its last. And out of its eyes there shines the indestructible principle in it, the archeus. What then has died during those thousands of years? Not the dog. It stands unscathed before us. Merely its shadow, its image in our form of knowledge which is bound to time. Yet how can one even believe that that passes away which for ever and ever exists and fills all time? Certainly the matter can be explained empirically. In proportion as death destroyed the individuals, generation produced new ones. But this empirical explanation is only an apparent explanation. It puts one riddle in the place of the other. The metaphysical understanding of the matter, although not to be got so cheaply, is yet the only true and satisfying one. Kant, in his subjective procedure, brought to light the truth that time cannot belong to the thing in itself, because it lies preformed in our apprehension. Now death is the temporal end of the temporal phenomenon, but as soon as we abstract time, there is no longer any end, and this word has lost all significance. But I, here, upon the objective path, am trying to show the positive side of the matter, that the thing in itself remains untouched by time, and by that which is only possible through time, arising and passing away, and that the phenomena in time could not have even that ceaselessly fleeting existence which stands next to nothingness, if there were not in them a kernel of the infinite. Eternity is certainly a conception which has no perception as its foundation. Accordingly, it has also a merely negative content. It signifies a timeless existence. Time is yet merely an image of eternity, o chronos ekon ton ionas, as Plotinus has it, and in the same way, our temporal existence is a mere image of our true nature. This must lie in eternity, just because time is only the form of our knowledge. But on account of this alone do we know our own existence, and that of all things as transitory, finite, and subject to annihilation. In the second book, I have shown that the adequate objectivity of the will as the thing in itself, at each of its grades, is the Platonic idea. Similarly, in the third book, that the ideas of things have the pure subject of knowledge as their correlative. Consequently, the knowledge of them only appears exceptionally and temporarily under specially favorable conditions. For individual knowledge, on the other hand, thus in time, the idea presents itself under the form of the species, which is the idea broken up through its entrance into time. Therefore the species is the most immediate objectification of the thing in itself, that is, of the will to live. The inmost nature of every brute, and also of man, accordingly lies in the species. Thus the will to live, which is so powerfully active, is rooted in this, not really in the individual. On the other hand, in the individual alone lies the immediate consciousness. Accordingly it imagines itself different from the species, and therefore fears death. The will to live manifests itself in relation to the individual as hunger and the fear of death, in relation to the species as sexual instinct and passionate care for the offspring. In agreement with this we find nature, which is free from that delusion of the individual, as careful for the maintenance of the species as it is indifferent to the destruction of the individuals. The latter are always only means, the former is the end. Therefore a glaring contrast appears between its niggardliness in the endowment of the individuals and its prodigality when the species is concerned. In the latter case, from one individual are often annually obtained 100,000 germs and more. For example, from trees, fishes, crabs, termites, and many others. In the former case, on the contrary, only barely enough in the way of powers and organs is given to each to enable it with ceaseless effort to maintain its life. And therefore, if an animal is injured or weakened, it must as a rule starve. And where an incidental saving was possible, through the circumstance that one part could upon necessity be dispensed with, it has been withheld, even out of order. Hence, for example, many caterpillars are without eyes. The poor creatures grope in the dark from leaf to leaf, which, since they lack feelers, they do by moving 3/4 of their body back and forward in the air till they find some object. Hence, they often miss their food, which is to be found close by. But this happens in consequence of the lex parsimoniae naturae, to the expression of which natura nihil facit super vacaneum one may add et nihil largitur. The same tendency of nature shows itself also in the fact that the more fit the individual is on account of its age for the propagation of the species, the more powerfully does the vis naturae medicatrix manifest itself in him, and therefore his wounds heal easily, and he easily recovers from diseases. This diminishes along with the power of generation, and sinks low after it is extinct, for now in the eyes of nature the individual has become worthless. If now we cast another glance at the scale of existences, with the whole of their accompanying gradations of consciousness, from the polyp up to man, we see this wonderful pyramid, kept in ceaseless oscillation certainly by the constant death of the individuals, yet by means of the bond of generation, enduring in the species through the infinite course of time. While then, as was explained above, the objective, the species, presents itself as indestructible, the subjective, which consists merely in the self-consciousness of these beings, seems to be of the shortest duration, and to be unceasingly destroyed, in order just as often to come forth again from nothing in an incomprehensible manner. But indeed, one must be very short-sighted to let oneself be deceived by this appearance, and not to comprehend that although the form of temporal permanence only belongs to the objective, the subjective, that is, the will, which lives and manifests itself in all, and with it the subject of the knowledge in which all exhibits itself, must be not less indestructible. Because the permanence of the objective or external can yet only be the phenomenal appearance of the indestructibility of the subjective or internal. For the former can possess nothing which it has not received on loan from the latter, and cannot be essentially and originally an objective, a phenomenon, and then secondarily and accidentally a subjective, a thing in itself, a self-consciousness. For clearly the former as a manifestation presupposes something which manifests itself, as being for other presupposes a being for self, and as object presupposes a subject, and not conversely, because everywhere the root of things must lie in that which they are for themselves, thus in the subjective, not in the objective, that is, in that which they are only for others in a foreign consciousness. Accordingly, we found in the first book that the right starting point for philosophy is essentially and necessarily the subjective, that is, the idealistic starting point, and also that the opposite starting point, that which proceeds from the objective, leads to materialism. At bottom, however, we are far more one with the world than we commonly suppose. Its inner nature is our will, its phenomenal appearance is our idea. For anyone who could bring this unity of being to distinct consciousness, the difference between the continuance of the external world after his death and his own continuance after death would vanish. The two would present themselves to him as one and the same, nay, he would laugh at the delusion that could separate them. For the understanding of the indestructibility of our nature coincides with that of the identity of the macrocosm and the microcosm. Meanwhile, one may obtain light upon what is said here by a peculiar experiment, performed by means of the imagination, an experiment which might be called metaphysical. Let anyone try to present vividly to his mind the time, in any case not far distant, when he will be dead. Then he thinks himself away and lets the world go on existing. But soon, to his own astonishment, he will discover that he was nevertheless still there, for he intended to present the world to his mind without himself, but the ego is the immediate element in consciousness, through which alone the world is brought about, and for which alone it exists. This center of all existence, this kernel of all reality, is to be abolished, and yet the world is to go on existing. It is a thought which can be conceived in the abstract, but not realized. The endeavor to accomplish this, the attempt to think the secondary without the primary, the conditioned without the condition, that which is supported without the supporter, always fails. Much in the same way as the attempt to think an equilateral right-angled triangle, or a destruction or origination of matter, and similar impossibilities. Instead of what was intended, the feeling here presses upon us that the world is not less in us than we in it, and that the source of all reality lies within us. The result is really this. The time when I shall not be will objectively come, but subjectively it can never come. It might therefore, indeed, be asked how far every one in his heart actually believes in a thing which he really cannot conceive at all, or whether, since the profound consciousness of the indestructibleness of our true nature associates itself with that merely intellectual experiment, which, however, has already been made more or less distinctly by every one, whether, I say, our own death is not perhaps for us at bottom the most incredible thing in the world. The deep conviction of the indestructibleness of our nature through death, which, as is also shown by the inevitable qualms of conscience at its approach, every one carries at the bottom of his heart, depends altogether upon the consciousness of the original and eternal nature of our being. Therefore Spinoza expresses it thus: sentimus experimurque nos aeternos esse. For a reasonable man can only think of himself as imperishable because he thinks of himself as without beginning, as eternal, in fact, as timeless. Whoever, on the other hand, regards himself as having become out of nothing, must also think that he will again become nothing, for that an eternity had passed before he was, and then a second eternity had begun, through which he will never cease to be, is a monstrous thought. Really, the most solid ground for our immortality is the old principle, ex nihilo nihil fit, et in nihilum nihil potest reverti. Theophrastus Paracelsus very happily says, in Works, Strasbourg, 1603, volume 2, page 6, the soul in me has arisen out of something. Therefore it does not come to nothing, for it comes out of something. He gives the true reason. But whoever regards the birth of the man as his absolute beginning must regard death as his absolute end. For both are what they are in the same sense. Consequently, everyone can only think of himself as immortal so far as he also thinks of himself as unborn, and in the same sense. What birth is, that also is death. according to its nature and significance. It is the same line drawn in two directions. If the former is an actual arising out of nothing, then the latter is also an actual annihilation. But in truth, it is only by means of the eternity of our real being that we can conceive it as imperishable, and consequently this imperishableness is not temporal. The assumption that man is made out of nothing leads necessarily to the assumption that death is his absolute end. Thus, in this, the Old Testament is perfectly consistent, for no doctrine of immortality is suitable to a creation out of nothing. New Testament Christianity has such a doctrine because it is Indian in spirit, and therefore more than probably also of Indian origin, although only indirectly through Egypt. But to the Jewish stem, upon which that Indian wisdom had to be grafted in the Holy Land, such a doctrine is as little suited to the freedom of the will to its determinism, or as humano capiti cervicem pictor equinam jungere si velit. It is always bad if one cannot be thoroughly original, and dare not carve out of the whole wood. Brahmanism and Buddhism, on the other hand, have quite consistently, besides the continued existence after death, and existence before birth, to expiate the guilt of which we have this life. Moreover, how distinctly conscious they were of the necessary consistency in this is shown by the following passage from Colebrooke's History of the Indian Philosophy in the Transactions of the Asiatic London Society, Volume 1, page 577. Quote, "Against the system of the Bhagavatas, which is but partially heretical, the objection upon which the chief stress is laid by Vyasa is that the soul would not be eternal if it were a production, and consequently had a beginning." End quote. Further, in Upham's Doctrine of Buddhism, page 110, it is said, quote, "The lot in hell of impious persons called deity is the most severe. These are they who, discrediting the evidence of Buddha, adhere to the heretical doctrine that all living beings had their beginning in the mother's womb and will have their end in death." Whoever conceives his existence as merely accidental must certainly fear that he will lose it by death. On the other hand, whoever sees, even only in general, that his existence rests upon some kind of original necessity, will not believe that this which has produced so wonderful a thing is limited to such a brief span of time, but that it is active in every one. But he will recognize his existence as necessary, who reflects that up till now, when he exists, already an infinite time, thus also an infinity of changes has run its course. But in spite of this he yet exists. Thus the whole range of all possible states has already exhausted itself without being able to destroy his existence. If he could never not be, he would already not be now. For the infinity of the time that has already elapsed, with the exhausted possibility of the events in it, guarantees that what exists, exists necessarily. Therefore every one must conceive himself as a necessary being, that is, as a being whose existence would follow from its true and exhaustive definition, if one only had it. In this line of thought, then, really lies the only immanent proof of the imperishableness of our nature, that is, the only proof of this that holds good within the sphere of empirical data. In this nature existence must inhere, because it shows itself as independent of all states which can possibly be introduced through the chain of causes. For these states have already done what they could, and yet our existence has remained unshaken by it, as the ray of light by the storm wind which it cuts through. If time, of its own resources, could bring us to a happy state, then we would already have been there long ago, for an infinite time lies behind us. But also, if it could lead us to destruction, we would already have long been no more. From the fact that we now exist, it follows, if well considered, that we must at all times exist. For we are ourselves the nature which time has taken up into itself in order to fill its void. Consequently, it fills the whole of time, present, past, and future, in the same way, and it is just as impossible for us to fall out of existence as to fall out of space. Carefully considered, it is inconceivable that what once exists in all the strength of reality should ever become nothing, and then not be, through an infinite time. Hence has arisen the Christian doctrine of the restoration of all things, that of the Hindus of the constantly repeated creation of the world by Brahma, together with similar dogmas of the Greek philosophers. The great mystery of our being and not being, to explain which these and all kindred dogmas have been devised, ultimately rests upon the fact that the same thing which objectively constitutes an infinite course of time is subjectively an indivisible, ever-present present. But who comprehends it? It has been most distinctly set forth by Kant in his immortal doctrine of the ideality of time and the sole reality of the thing in itself. For it results from this that the really essential part of things, of man, of the world, lies permanently and enduringly in the nunc stans, firm and immovable, and that the change of the phenomena and events is a mere consequence of our apprehension of them by means of our form of perception, which is time. Accordingly, instead of saying to men, ye have arisen through birth, but are immortal, one ought to say to them, ye are not nothing, and teach them to understand this in the sense of the saying attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, togar on ae estai, that is, quod enim est, erit semper. If, however, this does not succeed, but the anxious heart raises its old lament, I see all beings arise through birth out of nothing, and after a brief term again return to this. My existence also now in the present will soon lie in the distant past, and I will be nothing. The right answer is, dost thou not exist? Hast thou not within thee the valuable present, after which ye children of time so eagerly strive, now within, actually within? And dost thou understand how thou hast attained to it? Knowest thou the paths which have led thee to it, that thou canst know they will be shut against thee by death? An existence of thyself after the destruction of thy body is not conceivable by thee as possible. But can it be more inconceivable to thee than thy present existence, and how thou hast attained to it? Why shouldst thou doubt but that the secret paths to this present, which stood open to thee, will also stand open to every future present? If, then, considerations of this kind are at any rate adapted to awaken the conviction that there is something in us which death cannot destroy, this yet only takes place by raising us to a point of view from which birth is not the only beginning of our existence. For from this it follows that what is proved to be indestructible by death is not properly the individual, which, moreover, as having arisen through generation, and having in itself the qualities of the father and mother, presents itself as a mere difference of the species, but as such can only be finite. As, in accordance with this, the individual has no recollection of its existence before its birth, so it can have no remembrance of its present existence after death. But everyone places his ego in consciousness. This seems to him, therefore, to be bound to individuality, with which, besides, everything disappears which is peculiar to him, as to this, and distinguishes him from others. His continued existence without individuality becomes to him, therefore, indistinguishable from the continuance of other beings, and he sees his ego sink. But whoever thus links his existence to the identity of consciousness, and therefore desires an endless existence after death for this, ought to reflect that he can certainly only attain this at the price of just as endless a past before birth. For since he has no remembrance of an existence before birth, thus his consciousness begins with birth, he must accept his birth as an origination of his existence out of nothing. But then he purchases the endless time of his existence after death for just as long a time before birth. Thus the account balances without any profit for him. If, on the other hand, the existence which death leaves untouched is different from that of the individual consciousness, then it must be independent of birth, just as of death, and therefore with regard to it, it must be equally true to say, I will always be, and I have always been, which then gives two infinities for one. But the great equivocation really lies in the word I, as any one will see at once who remembers the contents of our second book, and the separation which is made there of the willing from the knowing part of our nature. According as I understand this word, I can say, death is my complete end, or this my personal phenomenal existence is just as infinitely small a part of my true nature as I am of the world. But the I is the dark point in consciousness, as on the retina the exact point at which the nerve of sight enters is blind, as the brain itself is entirely without sensation, the body of the sun is dark, and the eye sees all except itself. Our faculty of knowledge is directed entirely towards without, in accordance with the fact that it is the product of a brain function, which has arisen for the purpose of mere self-maintenance, thus of the search for nourishment and the capture of prey. Therefore every one knows himself only as this individual, as it presents itself in external perception. If, on the other hand, he could bring to consciousness what he is besides and beyond this, then he would willingly give up his individuality, smile at the tenacity of his attachment to it, and say, what is the loss of this individuality to me, who bear in myself the possibility of innumerable individualities? He would see that even if a continued existence of his individuality does not lie before him, it is yet quite as good as if he had such an existence, because he carries in himself complete compensation for it. Besides, however, it may further be taken into consideration that the individuality of most men is so miserable and worthless that with it they truly lose nothing, and that in them which may still have some worth is the universal human element. But to this imperishableness can be promised. Indeed, even the rigid unalterableness and essential limitation of every individual would, in the case of an endless duration of it, necessarily at last produce such great weariness by its monotony that only to be relieved of this one would prefer to become nothing. To desire that the individuality should be immortal really means to wish to perpetuate an error infinitely. For at bottom, every individuality is really only a special error, a false step, something that had better not be. Nay, something which it is the real end of life to bring us back from. This also finds confirmation in the fact that the great majority, indeed really all men, are so constituted that they could not be happy in whatever kind of world they might be placed. In proportion as such a world excluded want and hardship, they would become a prey to ennui, and in proportion as this was prevented, they would fall into want, misery, and suffering. Thus, for a blessed condition of man, it would be by no means sufficient that he should be transferred to a better world, but it would also be necessary that a complete change should take place in himself, that thus he should no longer be what he is, and, on the contrary, should become what he is not. But for this he must first of all cease to be what he is. This desideratum is, as a preliminary, supplied by death, the moral necessity of which can already be seen from this point of view. To be transferred to another world, and to have his whole nature changed, are at bottom one and the same. Upon this also ultimately rests that dependence of the objective upon the subjective which the idealism of our first book shows. Accordingly, here lies the point at which the transcendent philosophy links itself onto ethics. If one considers this, one will find that the awaking from the dream of life is only possible through the disappearance along with it of its whole ground warp also. But this is its organ itself, the intellect together with its forms, with which the dream would spin itself out without end, so firmly is it incorporated with it. That which really dreamt this dream is yet different from it, and alone remains over. On the other hand, the fear that with death all will be over may be compared to the case of one who imagines in a dream that there are only dreams without a dreamer. But now, after an individual consciousness has once been ended by death, would it even be desirable that it should be kindled again in order to continue forever? The greater part of its content, nay, generally its whole content, is nothing but a stream of small, earthly, paltry thoughts and endless cares. Let them then at last be stilled. Therefore, with a true instinct, the ancients inscribed upon their gravestones securitate perpetuae or boni quieti. But if here, as so often has happened, a continued existence of the individual consciousness should be desired, in order to connect with it a future reward or punishment, what would really be aimed at in this would simply be the compatibility of virtue and egoism. But these two will never embrace. They are fundamentally opposed. On the other hand, the conviction is well founded, which the sight of noble conduct calls forth, that the spirit of love, which enjoins one man to spare his enemy, and another to protect at the risk of his life someone whom he has never seen before, can never pass away and become nothing. The most thorough answer to the question as to the continued existence of the individual after death lies in Kant's great doctrine of the ideality of time, which just here shows itself specially fruitful and rich in consequences. For it substitutes a purely theoretical but well-proved insight for dogmas which upon one path as upon the other lead to the absurd, and thus settles at once the most exciting of all metaphysical questions. Beginning, ending, and continuing are conceptions which derive their significance simply and solely from time, and are therefore valid only under the presupposition of this. But time has no absolute existence. It is not the manner of being of the thing in itself, but merely the form of our knowledge of our existence in nature, and that of all things, which is just on this account very imperfect, and is limited to mere phenomena. Thus, with reference to this knowledge alone, do the conceptions of ceasing and continuing find application, not with reference to that which exhibits itself in these, the inner being of things in relation to which these conceptions have therefore no longer any meaning. For this shows itself also in the fact that an answer to the question which arises from those time conceptions is impossible, and every assertion of such an answer, whether upon one side or the other, is open to convincing objections. One might indeed assert that our true being continues after death because it is false that it is destroyed, but one might just as well assert that it is destroyed because it is false that it continues. At bottom, the one is as true as the other. Accordingly, something like an antinomy might certainly be set up here. But it would rest upon mere negations. In it, one would deny two contradictorily opposite predicates of the subject of the judgment, but only because the whole category of these predicates would be inapplicable to that subject. But if now one denies these two predicates, not together but separately, it appears as if the contradictory opposite of the predicate, which in each case is denied, were proved of the subject of the judgment. This, however, depends upon the fact that here incommensurable quantities are compared. For the problem removes us to a scene where time is abolished, and yet asks about temporal properties, which it is consequently equally false to attribute to, or to deny of, the subject. This just means the problem is transcendent. In this sense, death remains a mystery. On the other hand, adhering to that distinction between phenomenon and thing in itself, we can make the assertion that as phenomenon, man is certainly perishable, but yet his true being will not be involved in this. Thus, this true being is indestructible, although on account of the elimination of time conceptions which is connected with it, we cannot attribute to it continuance. Accordingly, we would be led here to the conception of an indestructibility which would yet be no continuance. Now this is a conception which, having been obtained on the path of abstraction, can certainly also be thought in the abstract, but yet cannot be supported by any perception, and consequently cannot really become distinct. Yet on the other hand, we must here keep in mind that we have not, like Kant, absolutely given up the knowledge of the thing in itself, but know that it is to be sought for in the will. It is true that we have never asserted an absolute and exhaustive knowledge of the thing in itself, but rather have seen very well that it is impossible to know anything as it is absolutely and in itself. For as soon as I know, I have an idea. But this idea, just because it is my idea, cannot be identical with what is known, but repeats it in an entirely different form. For it makes a being for other out of a being for self, and is thus always to be regarded as a phenomenal appearance of the thing in itself. Therefore, for a knowing consciousness, however it may be constituted, there can be always only phenomena. This is not entirely obviated even by the fact that it is my own nature which is known. For since it falls within my knowing consciousness, it is already a reflex of my nature, something different from this itself, thus already in a certain degree phenomenon. So far, then, as I am a knowing being, I have even in my own nature really only a phenomenon. So far, on the other hand, as I am directly this nature itself, I am not a knowing being. For it is sufficiently proved in the second book that knowledge is only a secondary property of our being and introduced by its animal nature. Strictly speaking, then, we know even our own will always merely as phenomenon, and not as it may be, absolutely in and for itself. But in that second book, and also in my work upon the will in nature, it is fully explained and proved that if, in order to penetrate into the inner nature of things, leaving what is given merely indirectly and from without, we stick to the only phenomenon into the nature of which an immediate insight from within is attainable, we find in this quite definitely as the ultimate kernel of reality, the will, in which therefore we recognize the thing in itself in so far as it has here no longer space, although it still has time, for its form consequently really only in its most immediate manifestation, and with the reservation that this knowledge of it is still not exhaustive and entirely adequate. Thus in this sense we retain here also the conception of will as that of the thing in itself. The conception of ceasing to be is certainly applicable to man as a phenomenon in time, and empirical knowledge plainly presents death as the end of this temporal existence. The end of the person is just as real as was its beginning, and in the same sense as before birth we were not, after death we shall be no more. Yet no more can be destroyed by death than was produced by birth. Thus not that through which birth first became possible. In this sense, natus et denatus is a beautiful expression. But now the whole of empirical knowledge affords us merely phenomena. Therefore only phenomena are involved in the temporal processes of coming into being and passing away, and not that which manifests itself in the phenomena, the thing in itself. For this, the opposition of coming into being and passing away, conditioned by the brain, does not exist at all, but has here lost meaning and significance. It thus remains untouched by the temporal end of a temporal phenomenon, and constantly retains that existence to which the conceptions of beginning, end, and continuance are not applicable. But the thing in itself, so far as we can follow it, is in every phenomenal being the will of this being, so also in man. Consciousness, on the other hand, consists in knowledge. But knowledge, as activity of the brain, and consequently as function of the organism, belongs, as has been sufficiently proved, to the mere phenomenon, and therefore ends with this. The will alone, whose work, or rather whose image, was the body, is that which is indestructible. The sharp distinction of will from knowledge together with the primacy of the former, which constitutes the fundamental characteristic of my philosophy, is therefore the only key to the contradiction which presents itself in so many ways, and arises ever anew in every consciousness, even the most crude, that death is our end, and that yet we must be eternal and indestructible, thus the sentimus experimurque nos aeternos esse of Spinoza. All philosophers have erred in this. They place the metaphysical, the indestructible, the eternal element in man in the intellect. It lies exclusively in the will, which is entirely different from the intellect, and alone is original. The intellect, as was most fully shown in the second book, is a secondary phenomenon, and conditioned by the brain, therefore beginning and ending with this. The will alone is that which conditions, the kernel of the whole phenomenon, consequently free from the forms of the phenomenon to which time belongs, thus also indestructible. Accordingly, with death, consciousness is certainly lost, but not that which produced and sustained consciousness. Life is extinguished, but not the principle of life also, which manifested itself in it. Therefore, a sure feeling informs everyone that there is something in him which is absolutely imperishable and indestructible. Indeed, the freshness and vividness of memories of the most distant time, of earliest childhood, bears witness to the fact that something in us does not pass away with time, does not grow old, but endures unchanged. But what this imperishable element is, one could not make clear to oneself. It is not consciousness, any more than it is the body upon which clearly consciousness depends. But it is just that which, when it appears in consciousness, presents itself as will. Beyond this immediate manifestation of it, we certainly cannot go, because we cannot go beyond consciousness. Therefore, the question what that may be when it does not come within consciousness, that is, what it is absolutely in itself, remains unanswerable. In the phenomenon, and by means of its forms, time and space, as principium individuationis, what presents itself is that the human individual perishes, while the human race, on the contrary, always remains and lives. But in the true being of things, which is free from these forms, this whole distinction between the individual and the race also disappears, and the two are immediately one. The whole will to live is in the individual as it is in the race, and therefore the continuance of the species is merely the image of the indestructibility of the individual. Since, then, the infinitely important understanding of the indestructibility of our true nature by death depends entirely upon the distinction between phenomenon and thing in itself, I wish now to bring this difference into the clearest light by explaining it in the opposite of death, thus in the origin of the animal existence, that is, generation. For this process, which is just as mysterious as death, presents to us most directly the fundamental opposition between the phenomenal appearance and the true being of things, that is, between the world as idea and the world as will, and also the entire heterogeneity of the laws of these two. The act of procreation presents itself to us in a twofold manner. First, for self-consciousness, whose only object, as I have often shown, is the will, with all its affections. And then for the consciousness of other things, that is, the world of idea, or the empirical reality of things. Now, from the side of the will, thus inwardly, subjectively, for self-consciousness, that act presents itself as the most immediate and complete satisfaction of the will, that is, as sensual pleasure. From the side of the idea, on the other hand, thus externally, objectively, for the consciousness of other things, this act is just the woof of the most cunning of webs, the foundation of the inexpressibly complicated animal organism, which then only requires to be developed to become visible to our astonished eyes. This organism, whose infinite complication and perfection is only known to him who has studied anatomy, cannot from the side of the idea be otherwise conceived and thought of than as a system devised with the most ingenious forethought, and carried out with the most consummate skill and exactness, as the most arduous work of profound reflection. But from the side of the will we know, through self-consciousness, the production of this organism as the work of an act which is exactly the opposite of all reflection, an impetuous, blind impulse, an exceedingly pleasurable sensation. This opposition is closely related to the infinite contrast which is shown above, between the absolute facility with which nature produces its works, together with the correspondingly boundless carelessness with which it abandons them to destruction, and the incalculably ingenious and studied construction of these very works, judging from which they must have been infinitely difficult to make, and their maintenance should have been provided for with all conceivable care, while we have the opposite before our eyes. If now by this certainly very unusual consideration we have brought together in the boldest manner the two heterogeneous sides of the world, and, as it were, grasped them with one hand, we must now hold them fast in order to convince ourselves of the entire invalidity of the laws of the phenomenon, or the world as idea, for that of will or the thing in itself. Then it will become more comprehensible to us that while on the side of the idea, that is, in the phenomenal world, there exhibits itself to us now an arising out of nothing, and now an entire annihilation of what has arisen from that other side or in itself, a nature lies before us with reference to which the conceptions of arising and passing away have no significance. For by going back to the root, where by means of self-consciousness the phenomenon and the thing in itself meet, we have just as it were palpably apprehended that the two are absolutely incommensurable, and the whole manner of being of the one, together with all the fundamental laws of its being, signify nothing and less than nothing in the other. I believe that this last consideration will only be rightly understood by a few, and that it will be displeasing and even offensive to all who do not understand it. But I shall never on this account omit anything that can serve to illustrate my fundamental thought. At the beginning of this chapter I have explained that the great clinging to life, or rather fear of death, by no means springs from knowledge, in which case it would be the result of the known value of life, but that fear of death has its root directly in the will, out of the original nature of which it proceeds, in which it is entirely without knowledge and therefore blind will to live. As we are allured into life by the wholly illusory inclination to sensual pleasure, so we are retained in it by the fear of death, which is certainly just as illusory. Both spring directly from the will, which in itself is unconscious. If, on the contrary, man were merely a knowing being, then death would necessarily be to him not only indifferent, but even welcome. The reflection to which we have here attained now teaches that what is affected by death is merely the knowing consciousness, and the will, on the other hand, because it is the thing in itself which lies at the foundation of every phenomenon, is free from all that depends upon temporal determinations, thus is also imperishable. Its striving towards existence and manifestation, from which the world results, is constantly satisfied, for this accompanies it as the shadow accompanies the body, for it is merely the visibility of its nature. That yet in us it fears death results from the fact that here knowledge presents its existence to it as merely in the individual phenomenon, whence the illusion arises that it will perish with this, as my image in a mirror seems to be destroyed along with it if the mirror is broken. This, then, as contrary to its original nature, which is a blind striving towards existence, fills it with horror. From this now it follows that in us, which alone is capable of fearing death, and also alone fears it, the will is not affected by it, and that, on the other hand, what is affected by it, and really perishes, is that which from its nature is capable of no fear, and in general of no desire or emotion, and is therefore indifferent to being and not being. The mere subject of knowledge, the intellect, whose existence consists in its relation to the world of idea, that is, the objective world, whose correlative it is, and with whose existence its own is ultimately one. Thus, although the individual consciousness does not survive death, yet that survives it which alone struggles against it, the will. This also explains the contradiction that from the standpoint of knowledge, philosophers have always proved with cogent reasons that death is no evil. Yet the fear of death remains inevitable for all, because it is rooted not in knowledge but in the will. It is also a result of the fact that only the will and not the intellect is indestructible, that all religions and philosophies promise a reward in eternity only to the virtues of the will or heart, not to those of the intellect or head. The following may also serve to illustrate this consideration. The will, which constitutes our true being, is of a simple nature. It merely wills and does not know. The subject of knowledge, on the other hand, is a secondary phenomenon, arising from the objectification of the will. It is the point of unity of the sensibility of the nervous system, as it were the focus in which the rays of the activity of all the parts of the brain unite. With this, then, it must perish. In self-consciousness, as that which alone knows, it stands over against the will as its spectator, and, although sprung from it, knows it as something different from itself, something foreign to it, and consequently also only empirically, in time, by degrees, in its successive excitements and acts, and also learns its decisions only a posteriori and often very indirectly. This explains the fact that our own nature is a riddle to us, that is, to our intellect, and that the individual regards itself as having newly arisen and as perishable, although its true nature is independent of time, thus is eternal. As now the will does not know, so conversely the intellect, or the subject of knowledge, is simply and solely knowing without ever willing. This can be proved even physically in the fact that, as was already mentioned in the second book, according to Bichat, the various emotions directly affect all parts of the organism and disturb their functions, with the exception of the brain, which can only be affected by them very indirectly, that is, just in consequence of those disturbances. De la vie et de l'amour, Article 6, Section 2. But from this it follows that the subject of knowledge, for itself and as such, cannot take part or interest in anything. But for it the being or not being of everything, nay, even of its own self, is a matter of indifference. Now why should this purely neutral being be immortal? It ends with a temporal manifestation of the will, that is, the individual, as it arose with it. It is the lantern which is extinguished when it has served its end. The intellect, like the perceptible world which exists only in it, is a mere phenomenon. But the finiteness of both does not affect that of which they are the phenomenal appearance. The intellect is the function of the cerebral nervous system, but the latter, like the rest of the body, is the objectivity of the will. Therefore the intellect depends upon the somatic life of the organism, but this itself depends upon the will. The organized body may thus, in a certain sense, be regarded as the link between the will and the intellect, although really it is only the will itself exhibiting itself spatially in the perception of the intellect. Death and birth are the constant renewal of the consciousness of the will, in itself without end and without beginning, which alone is, as it were, the substance of existence. But each such renewal brings a new possibility of the denial of the will to live. Consciousness is the life of the subject of knowledge, or the brain, and death is its end. And therefore, finally, consciousness is always new, in each case beginning at the beginning. The will alone is permanent. And moreover, it is it alone that permanence concerns, for it is the will to live. The knowing subject for itself is not concerned about anything. In the ego, however, the two are bound up together. In every animal existence the will has achieved an intellect, which is the light by which it here pursues its ends. It may be remarked, by the way, that the fear of death may also partly depend upon the fact that the individual will is so loath to separate from the intellect, which has fallen to its lot through the course of nature, its guide and guard, without which it knows that it is helpless and blind. Finally, this explanation also agrees with the commonplace moral experience, which teaches us that the will alone is real, while its objects, on the other hand, as conditioned by knowledge, are only phenomena, are only froth and vapor, like the wine which Mephistopheles provided in Auerbach's cellar. After every sensuous pleasure we also say, and yet it seemed as I were drinking wine. The terrors of death depend for the most part upon the false illusion that now the ego vanishes and the world remains. But rather is the opposite the case. The world vanishes, but the inmost kernel of the ego, the supporter and producer of that subject, in whose idea alone the world has its existence, remains. With the brain the intellect perishes, and with the intellect, the objective world, its mere idea. That in other brains, afterwards as before, a similar world lives and moves, is, with reference to the intellect which perishes, a matter of indifference. If, therefore, reality proper did not lie in the will, and if the moral existence were not that which extends beyond death, then, since the intellect, and with it its world, is extinguished, the true nature of things in general would be no more than an endless succession of short and troubled dreams, without connection among themselves. For the permanence of unconscious nature consists merely in the idea of time of conscious nature. Thus a world spirit dreaming without end or aim, dreams which for the most part are very troubled and heavy, would then be all in all. When now an individual experiences the fear of death, we have really before us the extraordinary, nay, absurd spectacle of the Lord of the worlds, who fills all with his being, and through whom alone everything that is has its existence, desponding and afraid of perishing, of sinking into the abyss of eternal nothingness, while in truth all is full of him, and there is no place where he is not, no being in which he does not live. For it is not existence that supports him, but he that supports existence. Yet it is he who desponds in the individual who suffers from the fear of death, for he is exposed to the illusion produced by the principium individuationis that his existence is limited to the nature which is now dying. This illusion belongs to the heavy dream into which, as the will to live, he has fallen. But one might say to the dying individual, thou ceasest to be something which thou hast done better never to become. So long as no denial of the will takes place, what death leaves untouched is the germ and kernel of quite another existence, in which a new individual finds itself again, so fresh and original that it broods over itself in astonishment. What sleep is for the individual, death is for the will as thing in itself. It would not endure to continue the same actions and sufferings throughout an eternity without true gain, if memory and individuality remain to it. It flings them off, and this is Lethe. And through this sleep of death it reappears refreshed and fitted out with another intellect as a new being. A new day tempts to new shores. As the self-asserting will to live, man has the root of his existence in the species. Accordingly, death is the loss of one individuality and the assumption of another, consequently a change of individuality under the exclusive guidance of one's own will. For in this alone lies the eternal power which could produce its existence with its ego, yet on account of its nature was not able to maintain it in existence. For death is the dementi which the essence, essentia, of every one receives in its claim to existence, existentia, the appearance of a contradiction which lies in every individual existence. For all that arises is worthy of being destroyed. But an infinite number of such existences, each with its ego, stands within reach of this power, thus of the will, which, however, will again prove just as transitory and perishable. Since now every ego has its separate consciousness, that infinite number of them is, with reference to such an ego, not different from a single one. From this point of view, it appears to me not accidental that aevum, aion, signifies both the individual term of life and infinite time. Indeed, from this point of view, it may be seen, although indistinctly, that ultimately and in themselves both are the same. And according to this, there would really be no difference whether I existed only through my term of life or for an infinite time. Certainly, however, we cannot obtain an idea of all that is said above entirely without time concepts. Yet, when we are dealing with the thing in itself, these ought to be excluded. But it belongs to the unalterable limitations of our intellect that it can never entirely cast off this first and most immediate form of all its ideas, in order to operate without it. Therefore we certainly come here upon a kind of metempsychosis, although with the important difference that it does not concern the whole psyche, not the knowing being, but the will alone. And thus with the consciousness that the form of time only enters here as an unavoidable concession to the limitation of our intellect, so many absurdities which accompany the doctrine of metempsychosis disappear. If indeed we now call in the assistance of the fact, to be explained in chapter 43, that the character, that is, the will, is inherited from the father, and the intellect, on the other hand, from the mother, it agrees very well with our view that the will of a man, in itself individual, separated itself in death from the intellect received from the mother in generation, and in accordance with its now modified nature, under the guidance of the absolutely necessary course of the world, harmonizing with this, received through a new generation a new intellect, with which it became a new being, which had no recollection of an earlier existence. For the intellect, which alone has the faculty of memory, is the mortal part, or the form, while the will is the eternal part, the substance. In accordance with this, this doctrine is more correctly denoted by the word palingenesis than by metempsychosis. These constant new births, then, constitute the succession of the life dreams of a will which in itself is indestructible, until, instructed and improved by so much and such various successive knowledge in a constantly new form, it abolishes or abrogates itself. The true, and so to speak, esoteric doctrine of Buddhism, as we have come to know it through the latest investigations, also agrees with this view, for it teaches not metempsychosis, but a peculiar palingenesis, resting upon a moral basis which it works out and explains with great profundity. This may be seen from the exposition of the subject, well worth reading and pondering, which is given in Spence Hardy's Manual of Buddhism, pages 394 to 396, with which compare pages 429, 440, and 445 of the same book, the confirmation of which is to be found in Taylor's Prabodhandrodaya, London 1812, page 35, also in Sangermano's Burmese Empire, page 6, and in the Asiatic Researches, volume 6, page 179, and volume 9, page 256. The very useful German compendium of Buddhism by Köppen is also right upon this point. Yet for the great mass of Buddhists this doctrine is too subtle. Therefore to them simple metempsychosis is preached as a comprehensible substitute. Besides, it must not be neglected that even empirical grounds support a palingenesis of this kind. As a matter of fact, there does exist a connection between the birth of the newly appearing beings and the death of those that are worn out. It shows itself in the great fruitfulness of the human race, which appears as a consequence of devastating diseases. When in the 14th century the Black Death had for the most part depopulated the Old World, a quite abnormal fruitfulness appeared among the human race, and twin births were very frequent. The circumstance was also very remarkable that none of the children born at this time obtained their full number of teeth. Thus nature, exerting itself to the utmost, was niggardly in details. This is related by F. Schnürer, Chronik der Seuchen, 1825. Kasper also, über die wahrscheinliche Lebensdauer des Menschen, 1835, confirms the principle that the number of births in a given population has the most decided influence upon the length of life and mortality in it, as this always keeps pace with the mortality, so that always and everywhere the deaths and the births increase and decrease in like proportion, which he places beyond doubt by an accumulation of evidence collected from many lands and their various provinces. And yet it is impossible that there can be a physical causal connection between my early death and the fruitfulness of a marriage with which I have nothing to do, or conversely. Thus here the metaphysical appears undeniably, and in a stupendous manner, as the immediate ground of explanation of the physical. Every newborn being, indeed, comes fresh and blithe into the new existence, and enjoys it as a free gift. But there is and can be nothing freely given. Its fresh existence is paid for by the old age and death of a worn-out existence which has perished, but which contained the indestructible seed out of which this new existence has arisen. They are one being. To show the bridge between the two would certainly be the solution of a great riddle. The great truth which is expressed here has never been entirely unacknowledged, although it could not be reduced to its exact and correct meaning, which is only possible through the doctrine of the primacy and metaphysical nature of the will, and the secondary, merely organic nature of the intellect. We find the doctrine of metempsychosis, springing from the earliest and noblest ages of the human race, always spread abroad in the earth as the belief of the great majority of mankind, nay, really as the teaching of all religions, with the exception of that of the Jews, and the two which have proceeded from it. In the most subtle form, however, and coming nearest to the truth, as has already been mentioned in Buddhism. Accordingly, while Christians console themselves with the thought of meeting again in another world, in which one regains one's complete personality and knows oneself at once, in those other religions, the meeting again is already going on now, only incognito. In the succession of births, and by virtue of metempsychosis or palingenesis, the persons who now stand in close connection or contact with us will also be born alongside with us at the next birth, and will have the same or analogous relations and sentiments towards us as now, whether these are of a friendly or a hostile description. Compare, for example, Spence Hardy's Manual of Buddhism, page 162. Recognition is certainly here limited to an obscure intimation, a reminiscence which cannot be brought to distinct consciousness and refers to an infinitely distant time, with the exception, however, of Buddha himself, who has a prerogative of distinctly knowing his own earlier births and those of others, as this is described in the Jataka. But in fact, if at favorable moment one contemplates in a purely objective manner the action of men in reality, the intuitive conviction is forced upon one that it not only is and remains constantly the same, according to the Platonic idea, but also that the present generation, in its true inner nature, is precisely and substantially identical with every generation that has been before it. The question simply is in what this true being consists. The answer which my doctrine gives to this question is well known. The intuitive conviction referred to may be conceived as arising from the fact that the multiplying glasses, time and space, lose for a moment their effect. Taught already in the Vedas, as in all the sacred books of India, metempsychosis is well known to be the kernel of Brahmanism and Buddhism. It accordingly prevails at the present day in the whole of non-Mohammedan Asia, thus among more than half of the whole human race as the firmest conviction, and with an incredibly strong practical influence. It was also the belief of the Egyptians, from whom it was received with enthusiasm by Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato. The Pythagoreans, however, specially retained it. That it was also taught in the mysteries of the Greeks undeniably follows from the 9th book of Plato's Laws, pages 32 and 42. The Edda also, especially in the Voluspa, teaches metempsychosis. Not less was it the foundation of the religion of the Druids. Even a Mohammedan sect in Hindustan, the Bohras, of whom Colebrook gives a full account in the Asiatic Researches, volume 7, page 336 and following, believes in metempsychosis, and accordingly refrains from all animal food. Also among American Indians and Negro tribes, nay, even among the natives of Australia, traces of this belief are found, as appears from a minute description given in the Times of 29 January 1841 of the execution of 2 Australian savages for arson and murder. It is said there, the younger of the two prisoners met his end with a dogged and a determined spirit, as it appeared, of revenge. The only intelligible expressions made use of conveyed an impression that he would rise up a white fellow, which it was considered strengthened his resolution. Also, in a book by Unge Witter, Der Weltteil Australien, it is related that the Papuas in Australia regarded the whites as their own relations who had returned to the world. According to all this, the belief in metempsychosis presents itself as the natural conviction of man, whenever he reflects at all in an unprejudiced manner. It would really be that which Kant falsely asserts of his three pretended ideas of the reason, a philosophy natural to human reason, which proceeds from its forms, and when it is not found, it must have been displaced by positive religious doctrines coming from a different source. I have also remarked that it is at once obvious to everyone who hears of it for the first time. Let anyone only observe how earnestly Lessing defends it in the last 7 paragraphs of his Erziehung des Menschengeschlechts. Lichtenberg also says in his Selbstcharakteristik, I cannot get rid of the thought that I died before I was born. Even the excessively empirical Hume says in his skeptical essay on immortality, page 23, the metempsychosis is therefore the only system of this kind that philosophy can hearken to. What resists this belief, which is spread over the whole human race and commends itself alike to the wise and to the vulgar, is Judaism, together with the 2 religions which have sprung from it, because they teach the creation of man out of nothing. And he has then the hard task of linking on to this the belief in an endless existence a parte post. They certainly have succeeded with fire and sword in driving out of Europe and part of Asia that consoling primitive belief of mankind. It is still doubtful for how long. Yet how difficult this was is shown by the oldest church histories. Most of the heretics were attached to this primitive belief, for example, Simonists, Basilidians, Valentinians, Marcionists, Gnostics, and Manichaeans. The Jews themselves have in part fallen into it, as Tertullian and Justinus in his dialogues inform us. In the Talmud, it is related that Abel's soul passed into the body of Seth and then into that of Moses. Even the passage of the Bible, Matthew 16:13-15, only obtains a rational meaning if we understand it as spoken under the assumption of the dogma of metempsychosis. Luke, it is true, who also has the passage, 9:18-20, adds the words oti prophetis tis ton archaion anesti, and thus attributes to the Jews the assumption that such an ancient prophet can rise again body and all, which, since they know that he has already lain between 600 and 700 years in his grave, and consequently has long since turned to dust, would be a palpable absurdity. In Christianity, however, the doctrine of original sin, that is, the doctrine of punishment for the sins of another individual, has taken the place of the transmigration of souls and the expiation in this way of all the sins committed in an earlier life. Both identify, and that with a moral tendency, the existing man with one who has existed before. The transmigration of souls does so directly, original sin indirectly. Death is the great reprimand which the will to live, or more especially the egoism, which is essential to this, receives through the course of nature. And it may be conceived as a punishment for our existence. It is the painful loosing of the knot which the act of generation had tied with sensual pleasure, the violent destruction coming from without of the fundamental error of our nature, the great disillusion. We are at bottom something that ought not to be, therefore we cease to be. Egoism consists really in the fact that man limits all reality to his own person, and that he imagines that he lives in this alone and not in others. Death teaches him better, for it destroys this person, so that the true nature of man, which is his will henceforth live only in other individuals, while his intellect, which itself belonged only to the phenomenon, that is, to the world as idea, and was merely the form of the external world, also continues to exist in the condition of being idea, that is, in the objective being of things as such, thus also only in the existence of what was hitherto the external world. His whole ego thus lives from this time forth only in that which he had hitherto regarded as non-ego, for the difference between external and internal ceases. We call to mind here that the better man is he who makes the least difference between himself and others, does not regard them as absolute non-ego, while for the bad man this difference is great, nay, absolute. I have worked this out in my prize essay on the foundation of morals. According to what was said above, the degree in which death can be regarded as the annihilation of the man is in proportion to this difference. But if we start from the fact that the distinction of outside me and in me as a spatial distinction is only founded in the phenomenon, not in the thing in itself, thus is no absolutely real distinction, then we shall see in the losing of our own individuality only the loss of a phenomenon, thus only an apparent loss. However much reality that distinction has in the empirical consciousness, yet from the metaphysical standpoint the propositions "I perish, but the world endures," and "the world perishes, but I endure," are at bottom not really different. But besides all this, death is the great opportunity no longer to be I, to him who uses it. During life, the will of man is without freedom. His action takes place with necessity upon the basis of his unalterable character in the chain of motives. But everyone remembers much that he has done, and on account of which he is by no means satisfied with himself. If now he were to go on living, he would go on acting in the same way on account of the unalterable nature of his character. Accordingly, he must cease to be what he is in order to be able to rise out of the germ of his nature as a new and different being. Therefore death looses these bonds, the will again becomes free. For freedom lies in the esse, not in the operare. Death is the moment of that deliverance from the one-sidedness of an individuality, which does not constitute the inmost kernel of our being, but is rather to be thought of as a kind of aberration of it. The true original freedom re-enters at this moment, which in the sense indicated may be regarded as a restitutio in integrum. The peace and quietness upon the countenance of most dead persons seems to have its origin in this. Quiet and easy is, as a rule, the death of every good man. But to die willingly, to die gladly, to die joyfully, is the prerogative of the resigned, of him who surrenders and denies the will to live. For only he wills to die really and not merely apparently, and consequently he needs and desires no continuance of his person. The existence which we know he willingly gives up. What he gets instead of it is in our eyes nothing, because our existence is with reference to that nothing. The Buddhist faith calls it nirvana, that is, extinction.